The transmission didn't come with a plea for salvation. It came with the sound of 3 billion souls choking on ash. The coalition was burning, their elegant armadas reduced to slag. When they begged Earth for a miracle, they expected a fleet. We sent 1 ship. Not because we were arrogant, because the Goliath didn't play well with others, and because humanity's idea of a rescue mission looks a hell of a lot like an execution. The briefing room on Orbital Station Delta 9 smelled strongly of industrial bleach and old sweat. It was a sharp, chemical sting that sat at the back of Bridget Hayes's throat, making her swallow hard. She didn't want to be here. Her uniform collar felt too tight, the fabric scraping against a patch of dry skin on her neck. She rubbed at it absent-mindedly, her gaze fixed on the center of the table. Sitting across from her was Ambassador Vrek. Vrek belonged to the Talon, a species that usually resembled something between a greyhound and a mantis. Graceful, impossibly tall, built for a gravity much lighter than Earth's. Right now, though, he just looked broken. His exoskeleton, normally a polished obsidian, was dull and pitted. The translator collar strapped to his long neck hummed with a low, irritating frequency. It sounded like a dying mosquito. 3 cycles, the translator spat out, the synthesized voice completely devoid of the trembling terror that Hayes could see in Rek's 4 dark, liquid eyes. They took the Aegis sector in 3 cycles. We lost 80 dreadnoughts. The Zathi hives are burning. The enemy, the shale. They do not respond to hails. They do not take prisoners. They harvest. Hayes looked down at her hands. There was a faint tremor in her left index finger. Too much caffeine. Not enough sleep. She pressed her hand flat against the cold aluminum of the table to steady it. "We've reviewed the telemetry, Ambassador," Admiral Carter said. The older man stood by the viewport, his silhouette cutting into the glare of Earth below. He sounded exhausted. Everyone sounded exhausted these days. "Your plasma shielding is entirely ineffective against their kinetic penetrators. Your energy weapons scatter off their hull geometry. They are immune to our light," Rek rasped, the translator struggling to catch the clicking consonants beneath his breath. He leaned forward, the joints of his arms popping in the heavy station gravity. "The coalition is falling. You are a young species, humans. Brutal. Unrefined." Vrek paused, his mandibles twitching. It wasn't an insult. It was a desperate compliment. "We need your brutality. We need your fleet." Hayes let out a slow breath through her nose. The air in the room was terribly dry. "You're not getting a fleet," Carter said, turning away from the window. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered, casting deep, hollow shadows under his eyes. "Earth Defense Command cannot authorize the deployment of the home fleet to a sector 400 light-years away. If the shale bypass you and hit us while our pants are down, we're dead." Vrek made a sound like tearing paper, a Talon weep. "Then we are dust." "I didn't say we weren't helping," Carter interrupted, his voice flat. He pointed a thick, calloused finger at Hayes. "You're getting her." Vrek's large eyes shifted to Hayes. She stared back, feeling a sudden, intense spike of nausea. She hadn't asked for this. She commanded a floating war crime, a ship so deeply classified that half the Admiralty pretended it didn't exist. "One female?" Vrek asked, the translator failing to capture his profound confusion. "One human? To fight a swarm that blots out the stars?" "One ship," Hayes corrected. Her voice came out rougher than she intended. She cleared her throat, tasting metallic tang. Blood from biting the inside of her cheek. The Goliath, a single vessel? Vreck's posture collapsed, his long spine bowing. You mock us. The shale dreadnoughts are the size of your cities. They swarm like locusts. A single ship will be a speck of dust against a hurricane. Hayes stood up. Her knees ached. The gravity plating in her quarters had been misaligned for a week, and her joints were paying the price. She walked over to the hololith projector embedded in the table and slapped the activation stud. A wireframe image materialized in the air between them. It wasn't sleek. It didn't have the sweeping, elegant curves of coalition vessels. It looked like a brutalist skyscraper that had been ripped from its foundations, strapped to massive engine blocks, and coated in thick, ugly layers of ablative armor. It was entirely asymmetric, heavily scarred, and bristling with protruding cannons. This is the UNS Goliath, Hayes said, her tone devoid of any patriotic warmth. She hated the ship. She loved the ship. It was a complicated, toxic relationship. She doesn't use energy shields. She relies on 10 meters of depleted uranium and classified composite plating. She doesn't use plasma batteries. She uses magnetically accelerated tungsten carbide slugs the size of a shuttlecraft. Vreck stared at the projection. It is hideous. It possesses no grace. Grace doesn't win a fist fight in an alley, Ambassador, Hayes replied, turning off the projection. The sudden darkness in the room felt heavy. You want to survive? You're coming with me as an observer. Pack light. The Goliath doesn't have luxury suites. As she walked out of the briefing room, Hayes felt the familiar, cold knot tightening in her stomach. They were sending her into a meat grinder. Just one ship. It was suicide. But as the heavy steel doors hissed shut behind her, a dark, cynical part of her whispered the truth she dared not say out loud. God help the shale. The walk down the umbilical gantry to the Goliath was a transition from sterile bureaucracy to raw, industrial violence. The air changed the moment they crossed the airlock threshold. Vreck gagged, his hands flying to his translator collar as if it could somehow filter the smell. It smelled like a machine shop that had caught fire and then been put out with old coffee. There was the sharp tang of ozone, the heavy, suffocating scent of hot grease, and the undeniable underlying musk of 200 terrified, sweating humans crammed into a metal tube. By the ancestors, Vreck wheezed, his long legs trembling on the grated metal floor. Your atmosphere is toxic. It's just recycled, Hayes said, not looking back. She marched down the narrow corridor, her boots ringing out sharply on the steel. Keep up, Ambassador, and don't touch the exposed wiring. Chief Wyatt hasn't finished routing the secondary power shunts. The Goliath was not designed for comfort. The corridors were cramped, lit by harsh, flickering red lumen strips that cast long, distorted shadows. Pipes ran along the ceiling, groaning and shifting under pressure, dripping condensation onto the deck. The whole ship vibrated with a low, bone-rattling hum. It was the sound of the main reactor, a cage star struggling against its magnetic containment. You didn't just hear it. You felt it in your teeth. They reached the bridge. It was a cramped, circular room buried deep in the heart of the ship, protected by layers of armor. There were no windows. Humans knew better than to put glass on a warship. Instead, the walls were lined with heavy, armored sensory displays. The crew looked up as Hayes entered. There were no sharp salutes, no crisp military protocol. They looked like a gang of mechanics who had been awake for 3 days. "Captain on deck," muttered Elias Cole, the helmsman, not taking his eyes off his console. He was chewing on a thumb-bed piece of synthetic gum, his uniform unzipped at the collar. "Status, Cole," Hayes demanded, dropping into the command chair in the center of the room. The cushion was worn flat, conforming perfectly to her shape. She hated how comfortable it felt. "Spooling up the slipspace drive, boss," Cole replied, his fingers dancing across a physical keyboard. Humans still trusted physical buttons over holographic interfaces. You couldn't accidentally press a button when your ship was shaking itself apart if the button required 50 pounds of pressure to engage. "Reactor is running hot. Wyatt says if we push it past 80%, the port side manifolds are going to melt into slag. Tell Wyatt I don't care about his manifolds. I care about getting to Aegis Prime before the shale finish eating it," Hayes snapped. She looked over at Rek, who had backed himself into a corner, staring in horror at a bank of targeting computers. "Strap in, Ambassador. The crash webbing is on the bulkhead behind you." Freck fumbled with the heavy canvas straps, his multi-jointed fingers struggling with the crude metal buckles. "Crash webbing? Does your FTL transit require physical restraint?" Hayes didn't smile. "Our FTL tears a hole in the fabric of space and shoves us through it through brute force. It's not a polite process." She hit the internal comms. "All hands, this is the captain. Secure for slipspace jump. We drop into a hot zone in exactly 4 minutes. May God have mercy on our souls, because I'm not planning on showing any." She clicked off the comms and gripped the armrests of her chair. Her knuckles turned stark white. She closed her eyes, feeling the familiar wave of dread washing over her. She hated the jump. Everyone did. It felt like your atoms were being pulled apart and put back together by someone who only vaguely remembered what you looked like. "Initiating tear in 3, Cole called out, his voice suddenly tight. 2, 1, mark. The low hum of the reactor turned into a high-pitched scream. The deck plates bucked wildly. Vrek let out a terrified shriek as the ship violently pitched forward. Outside the ship, real space shattered. The Goliath rammed itself into the resulting wound, tearing through the dimension barrier with zero finesse. Inside, the gravity completely failed for an agonizing 3 seconds. Hayes felt her stomach drop into her boots, a sharp pressure building behind her eyes. The air tasted like copper pennies. She felt a warm trickle run down her upper lip and sniffed hard, wiping the nosebleed away with the back of a trembling hand. The horrific vibration lasted for what felt like hours, though the chronometer on her console told her it was only 3 minutes. The ship groaned, the metal screaming in protest against physics. "Approaching Aegis Prime," Cole shouted over the din of the drive. "Dropping back to real space on my mark. Bracing." The ship slammed to a halt. It felt like hitting a concrete wall at Mach 3. The inertial dampeners shrieked, struggling to compensate. Hayes was thrown forward against her harness, the straps biting brutally into her collarbones. The red lights on the bridge flickered and died, plunging them into absolute darkness for 2 terrifying seconds. Then the backup generators kicked in. Yellow emergency lights bathed the bridge in a sickly glow. Hayes gasped for breath, her ribs aching. She looked over at Rek. The alien was slumped in his webbing, clutching his chest, a milky fluid leaking from his spiracles. He was alive, but barely. Damage report, Hayes barked, unbuckling her harness and standing up. Her legs felt like jelly, but she ignored it. Adrenaline, cold and sharp, was flooding her system. Minor hull buckling on deck 4, a comms officer yelled from across the room. We lost primary sensors for a second, but they're rebooting. Put the opticals on the main screen, Hayes ordered. Let's see what we walked into. The large screen at the front of the bridge flickered to life. The bridge went dead, silent. Nobody breathed. Aegis Prime used to be a jewel of the Coalition. It was a massive gas giant, orbited by a lattice of delicate silver space stations and agricultural rings. Now, it was a slaughterhouse. The visual feed showed an ocean of debris. Tens of thousands of Coalition ships, graceful cruisers, elegant frigates, massive colony carriers, were torn into jagged, unrecognizable chunks of floating scrap. Frozen atmosphere drifted like glittering snow through the wreckage, mixed with the darker, grislier elements of a destroyed fleet. It was a quiet, profound devastation. But it wasn't empty. Hanging in the void, silhouetted against the swirling orange storms of the gas giant, was the Shale Armada. They didn't look like ships. They looked like massive geometric tumors of dark, porous stone and dull metal. They were jagged, asymmetrical, and entirely devoid of any identifying markings or lights. There were hundreds of them, swarming around the shattered remains of a Coalition orbital ring, systematically breaking it apart and pulling the pieces into glowing maws at their centers. "Sensors are going crazy, boss," Cole said, his voice dropping to a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might draw their attention. "I'm reading massive thermal spikes from those rocks. They're processing the debris, harvesting it." Vrek groaned, pulling himself upright in his webbing. He looked at the screen and covered his eyes with two of his hands. The Aegis fleet, 50,000 souls, gone. "You see now, human? You see the futility?" Hayes stared at the screen. The sheer scale of the enemy fleet was paralyzing. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, desperate rhythm. A heavy, cold sweat broke out on the back of her neck. Panic, pure and primal, clawed at her throat. "Run!" her instinct screamed. "Jump back! We are dead!" She swallowed hard, forcing the panic down into a tight, hard box in her chest. She locked it away. She didn't feel brave. She felt sick. But this was the job. This was what humanity did. They looked at the impossible, terrifying void, and they punched it in the teeth. "Tactical," Hayes said, her voice surprisingly steady, though she gripped the edge of the console to hide her shaking hands. "I want firing solutions. Pick the biggest, ugliest rock out there." The weapons officer, a young woman named Miller with dark circles under her eyes, looked up, stunned. "Captain, we're not running stealth. We're just engaging." "We don't have stealth, Miller. We have a ship that registers on sensors like a dying star," Hayes grunted. "Target the dreadnought at grid 049er. Lock the main spinal mount." "Locking spinal mount," Miller repeated, her fingers flying over the console. "Target acquired, but Captain, their armor is reading as a dense silicate metallic alloy. Plasma won't scratch it." "Good thing we don't shoot plasma," Hayes said. "Load a city killer. Depleted uranium core, high explosive tungsten jacket." Below decks, the ship shuddered as the automated loading mechanisms dragged a projectile the size of a school bus into the firing chamber of the massive magnetic accelerator that ran the entire length of the Goliath. "Sir, we're being painted," Cole interrupted, panic bleeding into his tone. The shale fleet. They've stopped harvesting. They're turning towards us. On the screen, the massive geometric ships began to pivot in eerie unison. There was no communication, no warning hail, just a silent, synchronized turn toward the single ugly ship that had dared to interrupt their feast. "They're charging weapons," Miller yelled. "Energy spikes detected across their entire formation. They're going to glass us." "Not today," Hayes whispered. She slammed her hand down on the red firing stud on her console. Fire. The Goliath didn't just fire its main gun. It experienced a controlled seismic event. The sound of the magnetic coils discharging was a deafening metallic shriek that tore through the ship. The recoil was so violent that the artificial gravity momentarily failed again, and the entire vessel was shoved backward violently. Dust rained down from the ceiling. A pipe burst in the corner, spraying a fine mist of hydraulic fluid into the air. Hayes tasted blood again as she was thrown against her console. She scrambled to look at the screen. The tungsten carbide slug crossed the void at a fraction of light speed. It didn't flash. It didn't glow. It was just a massive, invisible fist of kinetic energy. It struck the lead shale dreadnought dead center. The enemy ship's armor, designed to disperse heat and deflect energy beams, was utterly useless against raw, unadulterated mass. The slug punched through the thick silicate hull like a bullet through wet paper. It drove deep into the core of the massive vessel, the friction superheating the tungsten jacket until it detonated. The dreadnought didn't just explode, it shattered. A massive, silent shock wave rippled through the void, tearing the gigantic geometric ship into millions of jagged pieces. The internal explosion blew the vessel apart from the inside out, sending massive chunks of rock and metal tumbling violently into the surrounding shale ships, crushing smaller vessels in a chaotic domino effect of secondary impacts. The bridge of the Goliath was dead silent, save for the hiss of the broken hydraulic pipe. Vrek stared at the screen, his mandibles hanging open in absolute shock. The impenetrable shale, the unstoppable force that had broken the coalition, had just been violently, messily eviscerated by a single primitive kinetic strike. "By the stars," Vrek whispered. "What did you do?" Hayes wiped the blood from her lip, her chest heaving as she stared at the expanding cloud of debris. The terror was still there, cold and heavy in her gut, but now it was mixed with a dark, vicious thrill. "We knocked," Hayes said, her voice dropping to a gravelly rasp. "Miller, cycle the main gun. Cole, bring us in closer. Let's show these bastards how the Rust Belt fights." The silence on the bridge lasted exactly 4 seconds. Then, the universe exploded into light. The shale didn't panic. They didn't break formation or scatter like a conventional fleet would after losing a flagship. They simply adapted. The dark geometric shapes reoriented with a horrifying synchronized precision. The jagged facets of their hulls began to glow with a sickly, bruised purple light. "Energy spikes! Massive energy spikes across the board!" Miller shrieked, her voice cracking. Her hands were frantic on the targeting terminal, leaving sweaty smudges on the glass. "They're firing!" "Evasive!" Hayes barked, her stomach twisting into a cold, hard knot. "Throw us hard to port! Dump power to the lateral thrusters!" Cole didn't acknowledge the order verbally. He just ripped the heavy control yoke to the left. The Goliath was not a graceful ship. It didn't glide. It fought against its own mass. The lateral thrusters ignited with a concussive thump that vibrated up through the deck plates into Hayes's boots and rattled her teeth. Outside, a torrent of purple energy beams lanced through the space they had occupied a fraction of a second before. The beams didn't look like lasers. They looked like liquid fire, thick and cohesive. One of them clipped the starboard armor belt of the Goliath. There was no cinematic explosion. There was only the sound of a monstrous sledgehammer hitting the ship, followed immediately by the sickening high-pitched squeal of a blade of armor boiling away into the vacuum. The bridge temperature spiked by 10 degrees in a matter of seconds. The smell of scorched paint and burning ozone flooded the cramped room, harsh and chemical, making Hayes cough violently. "Report!" she yelled over the blaring klaxons. It wasn't a heroic command. It was a desperate plea for information to drown out the terror screaming in the back of her mind. Cole punched a heavy button, silencing the loudest of the alarms. "Direct hit to the starboard outer shell. Armor is holding, but we lost 3 meters of depleted uranium plating. One more hit like that in the same spot, and they'll cook the secondary magazines." Vrek was hyperventilating, a rapid clicking sound emanating from his throat. His 4 eyes were wide, fixed on the tactical display. Hayes looked at the secondary monitor. The tactical AI was attempting to categorize the swarm based on mass and energy output, throwing up a crude, flickering table on the screen. Target class. Estimated count primary armament. Threat level, Dreadnought, 12. Heavy plasma lance. Critical cruiser, 85. Multi-directional burners. High harvester, 200 plus. Grav tethers / kinetic moderate swarm fighters. Uncountable. Kamikaze / micro beams high. "There are too many," Vrek gasped, his translator failing to capture the absolute despair in his alien biology. He clutched the crash webbing, his long, spindly fingers trembling. "They are a wall of death. You have angered the hive, human. We are already dead." "Shut up, Vrek," Hayes snapped, not out of malice, but because if she let his panic infect her, she would freeze. Her palms were slick with cold sweat. She wiped them aggressively on the rough fabric of her uniform trousers. "Miller, cycle the main gun. I want another city killer in the pipe." "Cycling," Miller yelled back, but there was a tremor in her hands. "Cap, the autoloader is sluggish. The lateral burn misaligned the feed rail. It's going to take 40 seconds to chamber the next round." 40 seconds. In a fleet engagement, 40 seconds was a lifetime. It was enough time to die 10 times over. On the main screen, the shale fleet was closing the distance. They weren't using engines, at least none that registered on human sensors. They were just moving, riding unseen gravitational currents, a slow, inevitable tide of bruised purple light and dark stone. "They're painting us again," Cole said, his voice dropping into that terrifyingly calm register that only seasoned helmsmen hit when they were out of options. "I can't dodge a volley of that size, boss. We don't have the thrust." Hayes stared at the screen. Her chest felt tight, the air in the bridge suddenly too thick to breathe. She looked at the gas giant, Aegis Prime, looming massive and turbulent behind the shale fleet. Its atmosphere was a churning nightmare of ammonia storms, crushing gravity, and hypervelocity winds. It was a death trap. It was also the only cover they had. "Cole," Hayes said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Kill the main drive, dump everything into the maneuvering thrusters, pitch us down, straight down." Cole turned to look at her, his chewing gum frozen in his mouth. "Boss, you want me to dive into the gravity well?" We're a flying brick. If we hit that atmosphere at this velocity, we'll burn up, or the pressure will crush us. If we stay here, we're slag, Hayes countered, leaning forward, the straps of her harness biting brutally into her shoulders. Do it! Now! The Goliath pitched over violently. The artificial gravity struggled to compensate for the sudden change in vectors, causing everyone on the bridge to list heavily to the side. Hayes's coffee mug, forgotten on the edge of a console, shattered against the steel bulkhead, splashing cold, black liquid across the deck. The main engines died, plunging the ship into a momentary, terrifying silence, broken only by the hiss of the maneuvering thrusters, forcing the massive vessel into a steep dive. They plummeted toward Aegis Prime. Behind them, the void erupted. A coordinated volley of shale plasma lances crisscrossed the space they had just abandoned, illuminating the bridge in a blinding, strobing flash of violet. "They missed!" Miller cheered, a sharp, hysterical sound. "They won't miss again," Hayes muttered, gripping the armrests. "Brace for atmospheric entry. Warning: structural integrity compromised. External temperature exceeding 4,000 degrees. Gravitational shear detected." The automated voice of the ship's computer was calm, a stark contrast to the absolute chaos enveloping the vessel. Hitting the upper atmosphere of the gas giant felt like being swallowed by a washing machine filled with gravel. The Goliath didn't slice through the clouds. It slammed into them. The sky outside the forward optical sensors turned from the black of space to a blinding, furious orange. The roar of friction was deafening. It was a physical weight pressing against the eardrums. The entire ship vibrated with a sickening frequency that made Hayes's teeth ache and her vision blur. The red emergency lights flickered wildly. "Heat shielding is burning away!" Cole shouted over the din, wrestling with the manual flight yoke. His forearms were corded with strain, sweat pouring down his forehead and stinging his eyes. "Gravity shear is trying to tear the port engine nacelle clean off. Keep us in the upper thermosphere," Hayes commanded, coughing as the smell of burning wires grew stronger. A plume of acrid white smoke vented from a console in the back of the room. "We just need the atmospheric interference to blind their sensors." "Captain!" Chief Wyatt's voice crackled over the internal comms, heavily distorted by static and the roar of the ship. He sounded frantic. "You're cooking us alive down here. The reactor coolant lines are boiling." "Hold it together, Chief. I need 3 more minutes," Hayes yelled back, slamming her fist against the comms panel. She pulled up the internal damage schematic. It was a mess of amber and red warnings. "Deck 3, life support, failing. Atmospheric venting detected. Port heat sinks, 98% capacity, meltdown imminent. Aft sensor array, destroyed, thermal ablation. Spinal mount autoloader, rail alignment at 85%. The ship was tearing itself apart. Hayes felt a deep, twisting guilt in her gut. She was killing her own crew just to buy time. She tasted bile at the back of her throat and swallowed it down violently. Focus. Just focus on the enemy. "Sensors are blind," Miller reported, pounding her fist against the side of her monitor in frustration. "The ammonia clouds and magnetic storms are completely jamming our LiDAR. I can't see the shale fleet." "That means they can't see us either," Hayes said. She unbuckled her harness, struggling against the heavy vibrations and the shifting gravity, and staggered over to Miller's station. She grabbed the edge of the console to stay upright, her knuckles white. Switch to acoustic and thermal, their massive rocks emitting huge amounts of energy, They'll punch a hole in this storm. Miller nodded, her fingers flying over the keys. The optical feed vanished, replaced by a swirling, chaotic map of thermal currents. For a terrifying minute, there was nothing but the storm. Just the deafening roar of the ship burning in the atmosphere and the suffocating heat building inside the bridge. Freck had curled into a tight ball in his webbing, his eyes squeezed shut, emitting a low, continuous whine of pure terror. Then, the thermal map pinged. 3 massive cold spots appeared directly above them, pushing through the turbulent orange clouds. They weren't generating heat. They were absorbing it, chilling the atmosphere around them as they descended into the gas giant in pursuit. "Got them," Miller hissed, a feral grin breaking through her terror. 3 cruisers dropping right on top of us. Range is point blank, less than 50 kilometers. "Autoloader status?" Hayes demanded. "Round chambered. Coils are hot, but, Captain..." Miller hesitated, looking up. "We're in an atmosphere. If we fire the Mac gun in this density, the backblast and atmospheric displacement might shatter our own spine." Hayes looked at the thermal map. The cruisers were closing. If they got within visual range, they would core the Goliath like an apple. "Do it," Hayes said softly. "Fire." The magnetic accelerator cannon was designed to be fired in a vacuum. Firing it within the crushing density of a gas giant's atmosphere was an act of architectural heresy. When Miller hit the firing stud, the Goliath didn't just recoil, it screamed. The displacement of the hypervelocity tungsten slug, tearing through the dense ammonia clouds, created a localized vacuum, followed instantly by a thunderous implosion of air rushing back in. The shockwave hit the Goliath a microsecond later. The deck bucked upward with bone-shattering force. Hayes was thrown backward, her shoulders slamming brutally into the edge of the command chair. Pain flared white-hot down her arm, stealing her breath. She hit the floor hard, tasting blood, her vision swimming with black spots. The deafening roar of the weapon masked the sound of the enemy cruiser dying. On the thermal display, the lead shale vessel took the slug directly through its ventral axis. The kinetic energy transfer in the dense atmosphere was apocalyptic. The cruiser didn't just break apart, it liquefied. The friction superheated the alien stone and metal, turning the massive ship into a blossoming flower of molten slag that rained down into the lower depths of the gas giant. But the victory was instantly punished. The remaining 2 cruisers were too close. They didn't need clear targeting data. They just aimed at the massive shockwave. "Incoming!" Cole screamed, pulling the ship into a violent barrel roll. A glancing beam of purple plasma slashed across the ventral hull of the Goliath. It was only a graze, but against a ship already stressed to its breaking point, it was devastating. The sound of the hull breaching was not a boom. It was a terrifying, hollow thump. The bridge plunged into complete darkness as the main power grid tripped. Red emergency lumens flickered on a second later, casting long, bloody shadows across the room. The deafening roar of the atmospheric friction was suddenly joined by the high-pitched, terrifying wail of the decompression klaxons. "Hull breach! Decks 4, 5, and 6, Miller screamed, coughing through the thick smoke that was rapidly filling the bridge. "Bulkheads are sealing, but we've lost pressure in the lower port quadrant." Hayes struggled to her feet, clutching her injured shoulder. Her left arm hung uselessly at her side, a dull, throbbing agony radiating from her collarbone. She ignored it. The cold reality of command clamped down on her emotions, freezing the panic. "Casualties?" she rasped, leaning heavily on the navigation console. "Comms are down in that sector," Cole replied, his voice trembling. He wasn't looking at her. He was staring at the blinking red lights on his board. "Engineering is still online, but the portside barracks, they're gone, boss. Vented into the storm." Hayes closed her eyes for a fraction of a second. 50 people. 50 mechanics, cooks, and off-duty gunners, erased in a heartbeat. A heavy, suffocating weight settled on her chest, a profound grief that threatened to pull her under. But she couldn't afford to drown. Not yet. "Cut the lateral thrusters," Hayes ordered, her voice eerily calm. "Let the gravity pull us deeper. We're bleeding speed, and we're bleeding air. Captain, if we go any deeper, the pressure will crush the hull," Cole protested, wiping blood from a gash on his forehead where he had hit his console. "Do it, Cole. The shale cruisers are built for void combat. Their porous hulls can't handle deep atmospheric pressure. We force them to follow us down, or we force them to break off." The Goliath groaned, a deep, metallic sound of agony as it sank further into the churning orange abyss. The pressure outside rose exponentially. The hull plating began to pop and ping, the bolt straining against the crushing weight of the gas giant. On the thermal display, the two remaining shale cruisers hesitated. They hovered at the edge of the upper thermosphere, their massive, jagged forms buffeted by the hurricane-force winds. They were calculating the risk. "Point defense cannons!" Hayes suddenly barked, a desperate realization hitting her. "They're launching swarmers. They're not coming down. They're sending the small fry." Miller frantically wiped blood and sweat from her eyes, squinting at the tactical board. "She's right. I have dozens. No, hundreds of micro-signatures diving toward us. They're riding our slipstream. Engage CIWS. Give me a wall of lead." The Goliath bristled. Along its scarred, blackened hull, dozens of automated rotary cannons sprang to life. In a vacuum, they were silent. In the dense atmosphere, they sounded like a massive, continuous sheet of canvas being violently ripped in half. Brrrt. The sound vibrated through the bulkheads, a relentless, teeth-rattling percussion. The swarmers were small, jagged pieces of rock and metal, propelled by gravity tethers, aiming to kamikaze into the Goliath's weakened hull. The human point defense net threw up a literal wall of depleted uranium shells. The dark clouds outside the viewports lit up with hundreds of small, kinetic detonations as the swarmers flew into the meat grinder. It was a chaotic, brutal melee. The Goliath shook violently as a few of the swarmers slipped through the net, slamming into the ablative armor with concussive thuds that sounded like distant thunder. Vrek, who had uncurled slightly, watched the display with a morbid, horrified fascination. "You fight like cornered animals," the ambassador whispered, the translator struggling to convey the mix of awe and disgust in his voice. "You tear your own vessel apart just to draw blood. It is madness." "It's survival," Hayes rasped, clutching her broken shoulder. She tasted soot and copper. The air on the bridge was thin and smelled of burning plastic. "Welcome to the mud, Ambassador. This is how humans win." She looked back at the thermal display. The swarmers were thinning out, shredded by the Goliath's relentless close-in weapon systems. But the two cruisers were still up there, waiting. And the Goliath was wounded, sinking deeper into a gravity well that would eventually crush them into a sphere of solid iron. They couldn't stay here forever. But they couldn't go back up. Hayes stared at the blinking red lights on the damage board, her mind racing, searching for a gap, a flaw, a stupid suicidal idea that just might work. Because out here, in the dark, stupid and suicidal were the only tools humanity had left. The descent into Aegis Prime was not a fall. It was a burial. The Goliath sank through layers of turbulent ammonia and methane, the external pressure dials on Cole's console spinning furiously into the red. The noise of the atmospheric friction had dulled to a deep, resonant groan that lived in the marrow of the crew's bones. It was the sound of a submarine diving past its crushed depth, a continuous, terrifying chorus of straining rivets and buckling titanium. The bridge was suffocatingly hot. The primary scrubbers had failed, and the air tasted like a mixture of sour copper and burnt hair. Red emergency lighting cast harsh, jagged shadows over the crew. "Captain," Hayes blinked, pulling herself out of a haze of pain. Gibson, a combat medic whose uniform was stained with someone else's blood, was kneeling beside her. He didn't ask for permission. He jammed a thick serrette into the unbroken skin of her right thigh. A wave of cold fire rushed up her spine, instantly muting the blinding agony in her left shoulder to a dull, throbbing ache. Her vision cleared, though the edges remained slightly fuzzy from the narcotic. Gibson quickly strapped her arm tight against her chest with a rough canvas sling, pulling it so taut that Hayes hissed through her teeth. "Collarbone is shattered, boss," Gibson muttered, not making eye contact. His hands were shaking slightly. He smelled heavily of antiseptic and stale sweat. "Don't move it. Don't breathe too deep. If a bone fragment nicks your subclavian artery, you'll bleed out in under 2 minutes. Noted. Get back to the lower decks, Gibson. See who you can dig out of the portside wreckage," Hayes rasped. She gripped the edge of the command chair with her good hand and hauled herself upright. Her legs felt hollow, but the painkillers were doing their job, layering a thin sheet of artificial calm over her rising panic. Gibson nodded silently and scrambled out the heavy blast doors, his medical kit clattering against his hip. Hayes looked at the tactical display. It was a mess of static. The pressure was wreaking havoc on their external sensors. But the thermal map still showed 2 massive cold voids lingering in the upper atmosphere. The shale cruisers. They were patient. They were just waiting for the Goliath to pop like an overripe grape, or for the humans to run out of air and try to surface. "Depth?" Hayes asked, her voice sounding unnaturally loud in the tense quiet of the bridge. 80 kilometers into the cloud deck," Cole said, his voice completely flat. He was staring straight ahead, chewing his synthetic gum with a mechanical, rapid rhythm. "External pressure is at 400 atmospheres. The hull is compressing. We've lost 3 inches of clearance in the corridors. The ship is literally shrinking, boss." "Wyatt," Hayes said, keying the internal comms. "Give me some good news," static hissed out of the speaker, followed by the chief engineer's voice. It was ragged, punctuated by the sound of heavy metal striking metal. "Good news is we aren't dead yet. Bad news is the primary heat sinks are utterly slagged. The reactor is cooking. We're at 94% thermal capacity. If we hit 100, the magnetic bottle shatters, and we turn this gas giant into a very brief, very bright star." "I need to vent the heat, Chief," Hayes said, staring at the thermal blobs on the screen. You can't vent it outside, Cap. The atmospheric pressure is too high. It'll just push the coolant right back down our throats. Hayes wiped a bead of cold sweat from her brow. She looked at Rek. The Talon ambassador was staring at the deck plates, his 4 eyes wide and unfocused, muttering a prayer in his native clicking tongue. He had given up. A cold, ugly idea began to form in Hayes's mind. It wasn't a tactical maneuver. It was a barroom brawl tactic, scaled up to a few million tons of steel and enriched uranium. Wyatt, what happens if we bypass the pressure valves and explosively vent the entire primary coolant loop out the aft thrusters all at once? There was a long silence on the comms. When Wyatt spoke again, he sounded horrified. The thermal shock would crack the engine block in half. The expanding plasma would ignite the methane pockets in this atmosphere. It would create a localized firestorm the size of a continent. And the updraft? Hayes pressed, her heart beginning to hammer against her ribs. The updraft would be a hypercane, a thermal geyser. It would blow us straight up like a cork out of a champagne bottle, Wyatt stammered. But the G-force would liquefy us, Cap, and we'd be flying blind on a pillar of fire with no main engines. We don't need main engines to go straight up, Hayes said, a grim, humorless smile touching the corner of her mouth. Cole, reroute all remaining auxiliary power to the structural integrity field. I want this ship as rigid as a steel rod. Cole stopped chewing. Boss, if we ride a thermal bomb up, we're going to punch right through the cloud layer. Those cruisers will be waiting point blank. That's exactly where I want them, Hayes said. She turned to the weapons station. Miller was staring at her, eyes bloodshot, a dark smudge of grease across her cheek. Miller, what's the status of the spinal mount? Rail alignment is critical, Captain. The barrel is warped from the pressure. If I fire a standard tungsten slug, it'll jam in the accelerator coils and rip the ship in half from the inside. Don't load a solid slug, Hayes ordered. Her voice was steady now, the narcotic hum in her veins sharpening her focus into a razor edge. Load the grape shot, the orbital pacification round. Miller blanched. The scatter shot? Cap, that's 1,000,000 tungsten ball bearings wrapped in a brittle sabot. It's meant for carpet bombing unshielded planetary surfaces. It won't penetrate their dreadnought armor. We aren't fighting a dreadnought anymore. We're fighting cruisers, Hayes corrected. And at point-blank range, it won't need to penetrate. It's going to act like a giant shotgun. Load it. Miller swallowed hard and turned back to her console. Chambering grape shot. God help us. Hayes hit the ship-wide comms. All hands, this is the captain. Secure for extreme vertical acceleration. If you aren't strapped to a bulkhead, you're going to break your neck. We are going back up. Wyatt, light the match. Deep in the bowels of the Goliath, Chief Wyatt slammed his palm down on the emergency manual override. Heavy physical levers were thrown. Thick steel locks disengaged with a series of deafening clanks. Millions of gallons of superheated, highly radioactive plasma coolant, pressurized to the breaking point by a dying fusion reactor, were violently expelled from the aft vents directly into the crushing depths of the gas giant. The reaction was instantaneous and apocalyptic. The superheated plasma met the hyper-dense, frozen methane and ammonia atmosphere. It didn't just boil, it flashed into a catastrophic chemical ignition. A sphere of pure white fire miles across blossomed beneath the Goliath, vaporizing millions of tons of liquid gas in a fraction of a microsecond. On the bridge, There was no sound, only a physical impact that felt like the hand of an angry god slamming into the ship. The artificial gravity generators screamed and blew their breakers, plunging the ship into 0G for a terrifying second before the sheer physical acceleration took over. The Goliath was violently hurled upward, riding the crest of an artificial, continent-sized thermal geyser. Hayes was slammed down into her chair, the foam padding compressing entirely under the crushing G-force. The air was forced from her lungs in a sharp grunt. Her vision narrowed to a tiny dark tunnel. She felt the blood draining from her head, her face pulling back against her skull. The pain in her broken collarbone flared through the narcotic haze, a blinding white-hot spike that made her scream, though she couldn't hear her own voice over the roar of the ship. Beside her, Vrek's webbing groaned, the alien's long limbs pinned brutally against the bulkhead. His exoskeleton creaked, a terrifying sound like splintering wood. The Goliath didn't fly. It was launched. It tore through the turbulent layers of the gas giant at a speed the hull was never designed to withstand. The ablative armor, already weakened and pockmarked, began to strip away in massive sheets, disintegrating into the fiery slipstream. The ship was groaning, a terrible high-pitched wail of metal being stretched to its absolute breaking point. "Hold together, you ugly bitch," Cole wheezed, his hands locked onto the manual yoke in a death grip, his knuckles white, blood vessels popping in his eyes. He wasn't steering. He was just trying to keep the nose pointed up so they didn't tumble and tear themselves apart in the thermal updraft. The temperature on the bridge spiked again. The air tasted of burnt metal and ozone. Alarms were blaring, a chaotic cacophony of failing systems, but no one could move to silence them. The G-force pinned them like insects on a board. 30 seconds. It felt like hours. The deep, rusty orange of the external cameras began to thin. The blinding white fire of their own making started to fade, replaced by the dark, bruised purple of the upper storms. They were breaking the surface. "Miller," Hayes choked out, tasting blood in her mouth. She had bitten her tongue clean through. "Get ready." "Rail, hot," Miller gasped, her fingers hovering millimeters above the firing stud, her arm shaking violently under the acceleration. The Goliath erupted from the cloud layer of Aegis Prime like a breaching whale, trailing a massive tail of fire, boiling ammonia, and shattered armor plating. They shot out into the cold, silent void of space. The sudden lack of atmospheric friction was jarring. The G-forces abruptly snapped back to normal, throwing everyone forward into their harnesses. Hayes gagged, coughing up a mouthful of copper-tasting saliva. Directly in front of them, hovering in the debris field, were the two shale cruisers. They were massive geometric slabs of dark stone, utterly silent, their hulls just beginning to glow with the purple charge of their plasma lances. They had been waiting for the Goliath to slowly, painfully crawl out of the gravity well. They had not expected a 2-million-ton brick of steel to be fired at them like a cannonball. The range was less than 10 kilometers. In naval terms, they were close enough to trade paint. "Fire!" Hayes screamed, her voice tearing her raw throat. Miller smashed the red stud. The magnetic accelerator cannon fired. The warped rails screamed, the magnetic coils burning out in a blinding flash of electrical arcing that blew out the forward observation cameras. The grapeshot round left the barrel. The brittle sabot shattered instantly upon exiting the muzzle, releasing 1,000,000 tungsten ball bearings, each the size of a grapefruit, traveling at a fraction of light speed. It was a literal wall of kinetic energy. There was no time for the shale ships to maneuver. There was no time to redirect their energy shielding. The tungsten cloud slammed into both cruisers simultaneously. The impact did not create a clean hole. It was a sanding belt applied to wet clay. The hypervelocity bearings shredded the dark, porous stone of the alien hulls. They tore through the outer armor, pulverized the internal structures, and ripped through the delicate plasma conduits that powered the shale vessels. The cruisers didn't explode in a single cinematic fireball. They were simply disintegrated. The massive geometric shapes dissolved into a violent, expanding cloud of pulverized dust, shattered stone, and purple plasma bleeds. The kinetic force transferred so violently that the remains of the cruisers were pushed backward into the void, tumbling end over end, dead and utterly broken. On the bridge of the Goliath, the silence returned. It wasn't the peaceful silence of the void. It was the horrific, ringing silence of a car crash survivor realizing they were still breathing. The ship was drifting. The main engines were dead. Half the bridge consoles were dark, sparking sporadically. The smell of electrical fires was overpowering. Hayes sat slumped in her command chair. Her good hand was gripping the armrest so hard her fingers were numb. She was breathing in ragged, shallow gasps, trying not to agitate her shattered collarbone. "Status," she whispered. Cole didn't answer immediately. He was leaning forward, his forehead resting against his dark console, his shoulders shaking. Slowly, he sat up. He looked pale, his face smeared with soot and sweat. "Main drive is offline. Engine block is cracked. We are adrift, Cap," Cole said, his voice hollow. "Life support is on emergency batteries. We have maybe 2 hours of air left in this section." "The enemy?" Hayes asked, turning her head slightly toward Miller. Miller was staring at her tactical screen. Her mouth was open in a silent shape of disbelief. She tapped the screen, wiping away a smear of her own blood to see it better. "The cruisers are gone. Just dust," Miller breathed, her voice trembling with a terrifying mixture of exhaustion and adrenaline. "And the rest of the fleet?" She keyed the main monitor, bringing up the long-range optical feed from the surviving aft cameras. The massive swarm of shale harvesters, the hundreds of dark, jagged shapes that had been consuming the coalition wreckage, were moving. They weren't turning toward the Goliath. They were breaking formation, their geometric shapes reorienting away from Aegis Prime, away from the graveyard. They were sliding back into the deep dark, riding the gravitational currents out of the system. "They're leaving," Rek whispered. The Talon ambassador had unbuckled himself and was leaning heavily against the bulkhead. His exoskeleton was cracked in several places, leaking a clear, viscous fluid, but his 4 eyes were fixed on the screen. "You killed their vanguard. You shattered their dreadnought and eviscerated their cruisers. The cost of this harvest, it became too high for them." Vrek turned to look at Hayes. There was no admiration in his eyes. There was only a profound, shivering dread. "You did not outsmart them," the alien breathed, his translator capturing the raw horror in his tone. "You did not outmaneuver them with grace or superior technology. You set yourself on fire and threw yourself at them. You are monsters." Hayes looked at him. Her uniform was soaked with sweat and blood. Her hair was matted to her forehead. She felt sick, her body trembling with the aftershocks of the narcotic and the sheer, unadulterated terror she had suppressed for the last hour. She didn't feel heroic. She thought of the 50 men and women who had been sucked out into the ammonia storms of Aegis Prime. She thought of the shattered, dead metal of the Goliath drifting in the dark. "We're not monsters, Rek," Hayes rasped, leaning her head back against the cold metal of her chair. She closed her eyes. "We're just the guys you call when you want a filthy job done. The aftermath of a space battle is not a victory lap. It is a slow, agonizing assessment of what is broken and who is dead." The Goliath hung lifelessly in the orbit of Aegis Prime, a scarred, blackened hunk of metal drifting among the elegant, frozen wreckage of the Coalition fleet. From the outside, it was impossible to tell which ships had belonged to the elegant Talon and which was the brutal human dreadnought. Everything was just scrap now. Inside the bridge, the temperature was dropping rapidly. With the main reactor offline and the heat sinks vented, the bone-chilling cold of the void was slowly creeping through the bulkheads. Hayes was sitting on the deck plates, her legs splayed out in front of her. Gibson had returned, moving like a ghost through the dim emergency lighting. He had splinted her shoulder properly, wrapping her upper torso in stiff carbon fiber bandages that made it hard to breathe, but stopped the excruciating shifting of the bone. He handed her a bulb of lukewarm recycled water. It tasted like iodine and plastic. It was the best thing she had ever had. "Casualty report, Gibson?" Hayes asked, keeping her voice low. The bridge was so quiet now that any sudden noise felt like a physical assault. 62 confirmed dead, Captain," Gibson said, his voice flat. It was the voice of a man who had shoved his emotions into a tiny box and buried it deep. "Most from the lower porthole breach. A few engineers got caught in the thermal backwash when Chief Wyatt dumped the coolant. Dozens of minor injuries. Broken bones, concussions, radiation burns." Hayes nodded slowly. 62. In the grand scheme of the war, where billions had died in the Aegis sector alone, it was a rounding error. But on a ship of 200, it was an amputation. It was the port watch. It was the people she passed in the mess hall. "Wyatt says he can patch the secondary manifolds," Cole called out from his station. He had pulled a heavy canvas coat over his uniform to fight the creeping cold. "He thinks he can get the slipspace drive online using the emergency batteries. Just enough for one jump. But we can't steer, boss. We just have to point the nose at Earth and pray we don't land inside a star." "Do it," Hayes said. She didn't want to die out here, floating in a graveyard that wasn't hers. She forced herself to stand, leaning heavily on her good arm. The bridge crew was moving sluggishly, taping over shattered glass, rerouting power through manual cables that snaked across the floor like dead black veins. Freck was standing by the primary viewport. The blast shutters had been manually cranked open, revealing the vast, silent field of debris. Millions of tons of Coalition ships, glittering in the faint light of distant stars. Hayes walked over to him, her boots clicking softly on the deck. She stood beside the tall, mantis-like alien, looking out at the destruction. "They will return, you know," Rex said, quietly. His clicking consonants were softer now, lacking the frantic edge they had held before. "The shale. They are a swarm. You have bruised them. You have forced them to recalculate the cost of this sector. But they are vast. They will adapt to your brutality." "I know," Hayes said. She took a slow sip of the terrible water. "When I requested aid from your coalition, I expected fleets of shining silver," Rek continued, tracing a long, multi-jointed finger against the cold glass. "I expected a savior, Instead, they sent a butcher. He turned to look down at her. Your species does not fight to win, Captain Hayes. You fight simply to ensure your enemy loses. It is a terrifying distinction. Hayes looked at her reflection in the glass. She looked 10 years older than she had this morning. Her face was bruised, her eyes hollow, her uniform torn and stained. She didn't look like a savior. She looked like a survivor crawling out of a trench. Ambassador, Hayes said, her voice dry and raspy. When a wolf is at your door, you don't call a poet to sing it a song. You call a bigger, uglier dog to bite its throat out. You asked for help. This is what help looks like. Vrek was silent for a long moment. He looked back out at the vast, drifting graveyard, then down at the ruined, blackened hull of the Goliath. Yes, the alien whispered, and for the first time, the translator caught a profound, heavy note of gratitude beneath the horror. May the ancestors forgive us. We are glad you are our dog. Hayes didn't smile. She just watched a piece of frozen debris drift past the window, reflecting the cold, distant light of a sun they were millions of miles from. Cole, Hayes called out, turning her back on the void. Spool up the drive. Let's limp this rusted bucket home. We have a lot of dead to bury. The Goliath didn't jump with grace. It shuddered, groaned, and violently tore a ragged hole in the fabric of space, dragging its battered, bleeding hull into the tear. Behind them, they left the silent graveyard of Aegis Prime, and the undeniable proof that in the dark, terrifying expanse of the galaxy, humanity was not something to be harvested. Humanity was the jagged piece of glass hiding in the grass. The Goliath limped back to Earth, a battered, bleeding testament to humanity's sheer, stubborn refusal to die quietly. We aren't the shining knights of the galaxy. We're the absolute last resort. If you enjoyed this gritty dive into human resilience, do your part for the home fleet. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this transmission with your fellow sci-fi junkies. Sound off in the comments with your favorite moment from the battle or what crude weapons humanity should use next. The galaxy is a dark, unforgiving place, but as long as you stick around, we'll keep bringing the heavy kinetic firepower. See you in the next drop.